Welcome everyone to Sihasin Hour. Yet Shea Athel Branchin She Biputotni Nishla Nakai Bashas Chin Sitnajani Dasha Che Do Nakai Dashanala Seizizi Denasha. And I'm speaking to you from Kinthana, as you can see from the background on my screen. And we are so honored today to have a special guest with us. Yesterday was Navajo Sovereignty Day, and we have Justice Raymond Austin here with us today to talk about Sovereignty Day. Justice Austin is from Northeastern Arizona. He's a professor of Applied Indigenous Studies at Northern Arizona University. He received his BS from Arizona State University, and he earned his law degree from the University of New Mexico Law School in 1983. He's also received a PhD in American Indian Studies with a law and policy concentration from the University of Arizona. So he's very, very distinguished guest here with us today. Justice Austin is a member of the Navajo Nation Bar Association and the state bars of Arizona and Utah. He served on the Navajo Nation Supreme Court from 1985 to 2001. And he's also served as a judge pro tem on the Arizona Court of Appeals and as a solicitor to the Pascua Yaqui Tribal Court of Appeals. He served as a visiting professor at Stanford Law School, Harvard Law School, Arizona State University College of Law, and the University of Utah College of Law. So we're just so honored to have you here with us today, Justice Austin. And I don't want to forget to mention that Justice Austin has also published a number of books, including Navajo Courts and Navajo Common Law, a tradition of tribal self-governance, and also Navajo Courts and Navajo Common Law. Oh, I'm repeating it there. But he's published a number of books that have really highlighted these things in tribal law and government that no one else has really focused on, like how tribal courts function and utilize their common law in order to shape their jurisprudence. So I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about that during our conversation today. But it's very exciting to have you here with us today, Justice Austin. I've always heard such wonderful things about you, just coming from a legal background, have so much tremendous respect for you and the work that you've done and your scholarship. And just it's wonderful to have you as a role model, just personally. So Justice Austin, if you'd like to introduce yourself, we'd love to do that. And then we can kind of go into our discussion about Navajo Sovereignty Day.
Okay, thank you. First things first, my plans. Boy had lineage, she was chin, Torich in it, as another 200 che. Chichibi toho liare nasha. I should tell you first off that I'm deaf. I can't sit down and engage in conversation with anyone. So I need, usually when I teach my classes, I have a court reporter who listens to whatever students are saying, questions and stuff, or current discussions and all that. And then they put it on a computer, then I read it off the screen. So that's usually how I do it. And so that's one thing you should know about me. And then the other thing is I'm a professor at NAU right now. I've been there 6 years. Before that, I taught at the University of Arizona Law School for 11 years. The folks over there at Applied Indigenous Studies at NAU wanted someone who was had some knowledge, at least on law and policy, the details of law and policy. So the president of the university asked me to come to NAU, and I accepted. So now I'm there. I've been there 6 years now. I teach classes on federal Indian law and policy, I teach a class called Sovereignty and Native Nations. I also teach, these are all the classes that I develop. I teach a class also on Native Americans and borders, the southern border between the United States and Mexico, and also the northern border and how it affects Native peoples. I also teach a class on criminal jurisdiction in Indian country. When I came to NAU, what we did is we set up a major, and this is a new major in Indian country criminal justice. And the whole idea behind that is to educate young people, and not just young people, but also people who may be on the job right now, like police officers, tribal court judges, whoever is interested. They can take coursework and get an undergraduate degree in the Indian country criminal justice. People who work in law enforcement, tribal police, BIA police, county police officers, FBI agents, people who are interested in these fields, casino security personnel, perhaps people who work in the tribal court systems, prosecutors, defense counsel. We have people who are called advocates, tribal court judges who may not have law degrees. These are the people that we're looking for. And so that if they're interested, they can study in our major and learn the stuff about criminal jurisdiction in Indian country. All the courses are online, so you don't need to be in a classroom. You can use your computer from your house, your home, wherever you are, and you can take those classes, and then at your own pace, you can get a degree, undergraduate degree in Indian country criminal justice. So the program is now in its second year. We'll be starting our third year this fall. We have somewhere around, I think, 5 or 6 students now. So what we're doing is we're trying to get more students into the program, especially people who are working right now on the job. So if you're interested in that, we sure love to have you become part of our program. Now, I've been asked to talk about Navajo sovereignty. The thing is, you really can't separate Navajo sovereignty from what is called, I guess they call it tribal sovereignty officially, legally. I refer to it as Native Nation sovereignty. It can't be separated. But when you talk about sovereignty of Native nations, what happens is it's like you end up going down a rabbit hole. You don't know where you're going to end up, because the whole area has a lot of contradictions in it. It's tied up with policy. It's tied up with actually the foundation of it, federal Indian law and policy. The foundation on which the whole subject rests is racism against Native peoples. And it all goes back to the time of discovery, and even before that, discovery meaning that to the time of European contact with what we know as the Americas now. But this idea of discovery has its own doctrine. It's called the Discovery Doctrine, and it was brought by Europeans to this country. So the idea of how you deal with indigenous peoples, not only in the United States and Canada and South America, but also in Australia and New Zealand, is based on the Discovery Doctrine. And this Discovery Doctrine was not new at the time that Columbus or the Europeans first made contact with the Americas. It had already been developing for, I guess, a couple of centuries or so before the first Europeans came to this country. So they have had a lot of experience using this doctrine and dealing with non-Christian peoples, non-white peoples before they came to this country. And the doctrine basically says that only Christians can own property meaning land, all that. The only Christians can own property that can be recognized under international law. And so what it does is it means that if you're an indigenous society and you're not Christians, in the sense of the Catholic Church or Christian, how Christianity developed. If you're not under that umbrella, then basically a Christian nation can come in and claim the land that you have, that you live on. And so that is basically what happened. So what happened is when Columbus came to this side of the world, if you read any of the history, what you'll see is Columbus comes ashore, and then plants the flag of Spain on the soil. And what he's doing is he's showing the world that Spain now owns the land that they discovered, because the people who are living there, the natives, were not Christians. And so what he did is he claimed the whole area. And if you read the history, that's what he says. He claims the whole area for Spain. And the people that are with him, his fellow soldiers that were with him, are witnesses to that. And later it'll become more developed. Well, they'll have an oath, something similar to an oath that they'll use every time they come upon a native village. They'll have people like the captain of the Spanish cavalry. They'll sit there and then they'll read the oath, even though the native people couldn't understand Spanish. So what they're really doing is they're telling them that we own this land now, and then we basically own you. We have control over you. The laws of Spain controls you, everything that you do. So that's how that developed, and that's called the discovery doctrine. And I teach my classes at NAU. I'm surprised a lot of the students don't know anything about the discovery doctrine. They know all these things about tribal sovereignty because they had classes on that, and then they come from areas like their reservations where the tribal council talks about tribal sovereignty and all that. So they're missing a big step. So that's the place to start when you're dealing with federal Indian law and policy. You start with the discovery doctrine. And so when we talk about tribal sovereignty, really I should say maybe the definitions or the contours of what we know as tribal sovereignty was developed really in the United States by the United States Supreme Court. And it goes back to three earlier cases. The first one is called Johnson against Macintosh, and that was decided, I think it was in 1823, Johnson against Macintosh. And there, what happened is you had some white folks who wanted land, and one side bought their land from the Indian tribe that live on those lands. And so they believed that they got legal title to that land because they bought the land directly from the Indian tribe. And then what the tribe did is they sold that same land that they sold to the individual non-Indians, and they sold that land to the United States by treaty. And so then the United States ended up owning the land under the discovery doctrine. And so now you have two sides of white people wanting their title confirmed as legal by the courts. So you have white people A, white people B, and it involves the same land. So the question is, which side, is that A or B, which side's title to this land can be recognized by the United States courts? And so the courts went through this whole long analysis. When you read these Cherokee cases, they're called Cherokee cases and Johnson versus Macintosh, the first thing you'll notice is it's loaded with what we call today as white supremacy. That's the framework that is used to decide these cases: racism against Native peoples, the idea of white supremacy, the idea that white people own this whole land, that they control the lives of the Native people, that they can recognize certain Native peoples as tribes and certain tribes as non-Native peoples, that type of thing. So what it is it brings out the whole idea about white supremacy in those three decisions. So basically these decisions were written by Chief Justice John Marshall. He was the Chief Justice at the time, but he had the agreement of the other justices on the court. And one thing that you should understand from this is you can see how important it is to Native people who sits on the United States Supreme Court. Now, if you have people who are right-wing extremists sitting on that Supreme Court, and this has gone on since at least 1980s, Native tribes and Native peoples are going to lose a lot of cases before the United States Supreme Court because their views are primarily against Native peoples and Native nations. And we've seen a lot of that for over 20 years now, going on close to 30 years now. And so what you have here are 3 United States Supreme Court decisions, Johnson versus Macintosh. The decision in there, what the court did is it took that discovery doctrine that came from European law, European international law, and adopted it as American law. So now we have this discovery doctrine, which is based on racism against non-Christians, racism against indigenous peoples and all that. Now it's a part of American law. So it's sat down and then the court goes on to use it. Now, which side has legal title to this land? And the court says the people who got their land grant from the United States government has legal title because under the discovery doctrine, the United States as the sovereign has complete title to what we know as the United States, is what it said. So what happened right off is the whole country that we call the United States, the title to that goes under the federal government. It goes to the federal government, the United States, and the United States, as I guess ultimate sovereign ends up owning the whole country. But what about the Native peoples who lived on those lands for thousands of years? What kind of ownership interest do they have, or what kind of interest are they left with that? And the court will then say that Native peoples end up only with what is called right of occupancy. Now, what is a right of occupancy? And then there may be debate on this, but you go out there into the mountains and you see deer running around, or else you see bear here and there. They have a right of occupancy. They have a right to live out there. And so what you see going on is you see the court equating Native peoples with animals. That's what it's doing. So Native peoples, all you have is a right of occupancy. It's like you just roam over the land and you'll see a lot of this kind of language that natives roam over the land while white people have established villages and towns and all that. Native people roam. And you'll see a lot of that, and not only in those 3 decisions, but later on as the court continues to develop what is called federal Indian law, you'll see a lot of that kind of language. And so what we're seeing right here is basically the foundation being set where you see Native peoples as being treated as being inferior, legally as inferior to white peoples. So that's what we're seeing at the beginning right now, and it will develop even more later on in other decisions. So you now have this superiority, inferiority framework that the court is now working with. Native peoples are inferior to white peoples. So we have that right now, and that same framework will become the basis of what we call federal Indian policies. So all federal Indian policies will sit on that framework of Native inferiority, white superiority. Now, some people talk about self-determination. They think it's a great idea, but you look at self-determination. What is self-determination? Self-determination is just a response to how the United States, the federal government, treated Native peoples for nearly 200 years. It's just a response to that. It's like what it's saying is, okay, Native peoples, we really, really screwed you. We put you into this real deep hole. You're down there now. And all this federal Indian policy that we had, like, reservation policy, assimilation policy, termination policy, all these policies that we've been subjected to for nearly 200 years. And now they put us way, way down into the depths down there, where you really can't get out of it. And then they come up with self-determination policy. Now, Native peoples, there's a new policy for you. You're down in the hole. Now you get out of there. You're on your own. See if you can get out of there. That's what self-determination is. It's really a response to 200 years of screwing Native peoples. That's what it is. And so now you're down there. How do you get out of it? You try all kinds of ways to climb out. And that's what we're doing right now. That's what self-determination is. So it's really a response to 200 years of federal government missteps. So now what we have here is Johnson against Macintosh, adopted the discovery doctrine. That's laying the foundation for what's going to become federal Indian law and federal Indian policy. Now we also know that Native peoples, their interest in land is not only what is called right of occupancy. The right of occupancy is still with us. You go over to the Navajo Nation, you have this huge reservation that's bigger than the state of West Virginia. What do Navajo people have? All they have is the right of occupancy. You don't have title to that land as the Navajo Nation itself. The federal government holds title to that land. It's like that all across the United States, reservations where Native people, the United States hold a title. Native people just live on it. They just have that right of occupancy. So if you really, really are interested in Navajo Nation sovereignty, why don't you get that title? Get away from the federal government. You own the title to that land yourself. Then you can be treated as a sovereign nation, because nations own land. They own title to those lands. That's like the United States owns title to the whole United States. You own title to that. Then you eliminate this thing called trust relationship, this thing called lands held in trust for the United States. That's a legal title. People think it's great, but it's a racist thing. It basically just says that Native people, you don't know how to own property. You don't know what to do with your property. That's the reason why the federal government has to hold a title and then let you live on it. See, that's what it is. Now, that's the reason why you can't have very much economic development on reservations, on Native nations, because the federal government owns the title and you really can't do it. You have to get approval, authorization from the federal government to set up a restaurant or service station or whatever it is on this, what is called trust land. So that goes back to the discovery doctrine and the idea of land as being held in interest called right of occupancy. And then, of course, later on, the next question becomes, well, what is the status of these people that we call tribes in the United States? And then that's where we come up with the Cherokee cases. The first case called Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. And there, the Cherokee Nation, they're really, really under pressure. All these white folks over there in southeastern United States want all those Indian tribes removed from that area. The land is fertile, great land for farming, all that type of stuff. And here you have all these Indians claiming that, that they have a right to live there. White people don't want them there. And then you have a great president that comes in that Trump loves, President Johnson, not Jackson or whatever his name was, Andrew Jackson, I think it was. And he comes in and he makes a promise and he said, you make me president, I'm gonna get rid of all those Indians and we're gonna move them all out of southeastern United States and send them west. That's where the Indians belong. Set up an area for them, what is called Indian country, which is now the state of Oklahoma. Move them all there. In fact, what we need to do is the entire country just load up all the Indian people all across the United States and dump them all in the state of Oklahoma. And that will be Indian country. They all live there. Then we have the rest of the country to ourselves. So that was the thinking. And so what happens is the Cherokee say, wait a minute, you can't remove us. We have a treaty with you. We made a treaty with you, a number of treaties. And under those treaties, we are sovereign nations. And under those treaties, we have our right. We were promised these lands. We gave up a lot of lands. We ceded lands to the federal government. The lands that are left over are our lands. We have a right to live there, and we have a right to live in the state of Georgia because these are our lands. We have a right to have a government exercise sovereignty over those lands. It's what the Cherokee said. So the case goes to the United States Supreme Court, and they file a lawsuit against the state of Georgia. And then the question becomes, do the Cherokees have a right to file this lawsuit against the state of Georgia under the United States Constitution? The United States Constitution says that a state can be sued if the party that is doing the suing is a foreign nation. So the Cherokee said, we are not part of the United States. We are a foreign nation, as that term is used under the United States Constitution. And so the court ends up with this question. And at the end, it says, Cherokee Nation. And when I say Cherokee Nation, we're also talking about all the Native nations, what we call 574 Native nations in the United States today. This applies to all of them. And it says, Cherokee Nation, you are not a foreign nation. You are not a foreign nation. It says, so you have no right, no standing to file a lawsuit against the state of Georgia. Only a foreign nation like France or Great Britain, whoever those nations, that's what it means when it says foreign nation, the United States Constitution. It does not mean you as Native peoples. In fact, you really are under the sovereignty of the United States. You're under the control of the United States. You don't have what this is called 100% complete sovereignty. You don't have that. All you have is a limited sovereignty, is what it says. And so what is it? The term that is going to be used to show that you are not a full sovereign. It says you are domestic dependent nations. That's what you are, domestic dependent nations. And the question immediately is, what in the world is a domestic dependent nation? You search all over, in your law books and all that, go on Google and all that, try to find a domestic dependent nation anywhere in the world. And there's no such thing as a domestic dependent nation. There are nations that, for example, you look at the Vatican is sovereign. They have all sovereign powers, but they're in Italy. So they're really, really granted this sovereign status within the nation of Italy. But that is a different kind of sovereignty that Native peoples have. The nation of Italy really doesn't have control or a lot of control authority to say this is how the Vatican should be. Doesn't do that. But when you deal with domestic dependent nations, what it is you're completely under the control of the United States, of the federal government. Now, what is this doing? Now, what it's doing is you're not recognizing yourselves, Navajo Nation, as a sovereign. You're not recognizing yourself as sovereign, or even as your people as sovereigns. What it's doing is your sovereignty is being recognized from the outside. So the United States is telling you, you are only sovereign if us say you're sovereign. You can't say you're sovereign yourself. And that is what is called, this term that is used right now is called federally recognized tribes. That comes from the domestic dependent nation stuff. So now the federal government goes out, BIA recognizes certain tribes, you petition, and they recognize you either as an Indian tribe or not. They have certain requirements that you have to meet. And so what we're having now is we're having the United States, the federal government, recognizing you as a sovereign, not you yourself as recognizing yourself as sovereign to the United States. So it's becoming one-sided. Now that's what domestic dependent nations are. And under this later on, other court decisions will say that when we say you're a domestic dependent nation, we control you, then that means plenary power. Is what it says, that we have plenary control over you. We can recognize you as a nation, and we can also wipe you out and say you're not a nation. And that's what they did with the termination policies in the 1950s, where they terminated over 100 Indian tribes. They no longer had the status of sovereign. So that's what they mean by this stuff called domestic dependent nations, and also later on what will become plenary power. So that's what we have today. So we're domestic dependent nations. Now, under this domestic dependent nations, how are tribes sovereign powers? What are used? Under the old way of looking at things, he used to say, well, as long as you didn't give up your power, your sovereign power by treaty, or else Congress didn't take it away by legislation, then you still retain that sovereign power. It's called retained sovereignty. You still have that. But later on, they'll add another one, 1978, a case called Oliphant. And they said that if the power you're exercising is inconsistent with your status as a domestic dependent nation, then you've lost that power. You lost that tribal sovereign power. That's what it is. So what is happening now is the United States Supreme Court is saying that you have only this power that we say you have. You can exercise certain powers. We can take it away and chop it off and make your powers even smaller and smaller. So that's what we're dealing with today in terms of this thing called tribal sovereignty. So you have domestic dependent nations, and this same idea is also going to involve individual native peoples later on. Now, you can run around and say, well, I know Native American and all that type of stuff. And you pay annual census, you look at that, and there's something like over 5 million people in the United States who claim to be Native Americans. But these are not really the people. Not all of them are what are called enrolled in Indian tribes. The people who are actually enrolled in Indian tribes are much smaller, probably around 3 million or so. But you have over 5 million people identifying themselves as American Indians. So now what is happening is you're looking at two views of who is an Indian, and this is a very, very complicated subject in federal Indian law, especially in criminal cases, because what happens is the federal prosecutor has to prove that if you committed an offense that you are an Indian or not. And then the victim has to be whether they're Indian or not. That will determine who has criminal jurisdiction in the Indian country. So now you have a situation where it's the federal government, again, the court systems, who are telling you you are Indian or you're not Indian person. You may call yourself an Indian person, but you may not be Indian under the law. See, so now you have outsiders telling you whether you are an Indian person or not. So it all falls back from that thing called the discovery doctrine, and then the domestic dependent nation stuff, the idea about plenary power. So the federal government is now meddling around in your own personal affairs and all that. So then we'll have that there. And later on, of course, after this case here, the third case is Wester versus Georgia. And they're basically, all of a sudden, Marshall is old now, he's close to dying. And I probably looked at what he did in earlier decisions, and then he said, wait a minute, I might have goofed here. And so what he does is he comes up with a completely different view. And now he said the question there, of course, didn't really involve white people who were sentenced to prison, and white missionaries that were sentenced to prison by the state of Georgia. And the question was what powers the Cherokee Nation had over its reservation, because what happened is the state of Georgia had completely taken away Cherokee lands and divided them up among the state as counties and said, Cherokee, you're no longer a government, we abolish you. And Cherokees, of course, said, no, you can't do that. We have treaties with the United States. We don't have treaties with you. So the United States Supreme Court says, yes, the Cherokees are right. They are sovereigns. They may be limited sovereigns, but they still have these sovereign powers. They have powers over their reservations. The treaty set out the reservation lands for them. They have authority over that. See, so the state of Georgia has no authority to come on to the reservation and then use its criminal laws to charge these white folks and then prosecute them and send them to prison, because what Georgia is doing is unconstitutional. It has no constitutional authority, has no jurisdiction. So during that long opinion, Marshall comes out and explains what tribal sovereignty is. Basically says that Indian nations made treaties with the United States, and under that idea of treaty making, they're recognized as sovereigns because only two nations can make treaties with each other. And the United States made treaties with Cherokee Nation, with other Indian tribes, so they have that sovereign status. And then, of course, if you have sovereign status, that means you have a right to territorial management. The reservations that were created, the Indian tribes has authority to pass laws to manage that reservation and also to manage the people who are on there. So that is called self-government. And now that Indian nations have self-government is what it says. Now, how about state authority? Do states have authority on reservations? Forrester versus Georgia says no, state authority stops at the reservation boundaries. States have no authority on the reservation. That's what opinion says. But later on, of course, the United States Supreme Court is going to open the door to state power on Indian reservations, and also Congress is going to open the powers of the door to state authority in 1953, called Public Law 280 and all that. So those three decisions basically set the foundation for what is called tribal sovereignty. And I'm getting close to run out of time here. Now, where does Kerr McGee fit into all of this? Well, in 1978, the Navajo Nation Council passed laws taxing businesses on reservation. They passed what they call the possessory interest tax, which is where companies who want to extract mineral resources from the reservation, they have these leaseholds, and the Navajo Nation taxes that leasehold interest. It's what it is, the leases. And so then the taxes are supposed to be paid to the Navajo Nation. They also came up with what they call a business activity tax. And there, in sales that are made, there's a tax put on it. Like you go to Basher's and you buy groceries, and then there's a tax on it, something similar to that. That's a sales tax. So they came up with these tax laws, and then these companies operated on Navajo Nation. They have leases to extract oil, coal, uranium, all of that. And so what their Navajo Nation is taxing them, but they refuse to pay the taxes. And they said that Navajo Nation, you can't impose these taxes on us. You are under the authority of the United States, under the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so your tax laws have to be approved by the United States before you can tax, is what they said. And so the question is, does an Indian nation need approval of the Secretary of the Interior to impose any kind of tax on businesses, whether they're natives or non-natives? And so that became an issue for the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court came back and says, nope, Navajo Nation does not need authorization. No Indian nation needs authorization from the federal government to impose taxes, because taxation is an inherent sovereign power. They already have that power of taxation. So unless Congress takes it away, or unless Congress puts limitations on there, then they have full authority to tax, is what the court said. And they said that taxation is necessary for self-government. Federal government has this policy of promoting self-government, and it fits into that, and taxation is necessary to further self-government of Native nations. It's also necessary for territorial management, is what the United States Supreme Court said. It actually relied on a prior decision that is called Marion versus Hickory Apache tribe. So they came out with this, and they said Navajo Nation has the authority. Kerr McGee tried to say that, wait a minute, under the Indian Reorganization Act 1935, you can need authority of the Bureau of Indian Affairs to have your tax laws effective. And the court says, no, the Navajo Nation is not even what is called an RRA tribe. So the IRA doesn't apply to the Navajo Nation, is what the court said. And so there you have it. The Navajo Nation has its inherent sovereign power to tax. And this applies to all 574 Native nations in the United States today. They have the inherent power to tax. But there's one problem. A lot of these, I shouldn't say a lot, but some of these 574 Native nations have constitutions and that have clauses in there that says that the federal government must approve, their constitutions, must approve their taxing, all that type of stuff, whatever they do. And the court says, and this is very, very important, the court says that any Native nation can change its constitution and get rid of the secretarial approval clause in their constitution. You don't need it. You have inherent sovereign power, is what it says. So those Indian tribes that have those clauses that have secretarial approval in them, they can get rid of them, get it out of their constitutions, and then they can rely on their inherent sovereign power, not only to tax, but also other areas. So there you have it. You have what they call, then this is what at that time that was decided, Kerr McGee in 1985. And so all this time, Kerr McGee and other companies had been depositing those tax monies into an escrow account. And so once the United States Supreme Court decision made its ruling that Navajo Nation has the power to tax, then that money was released, and it was several $1 million, millions and millions of dollars. So all of that went into what you call that trust fund that they're talking about today, Navajo Nation Trust Fund. So what it did is it released millions and millions of dollars to the Navajo Nation. So that's what that is about. And then the Navajo Nation says we won this case. So that's where Navajo Sovereignty Day comes from this case, Kerr McGee. So that's what you have here.
Wonderful. Thank you so
Let's see
much.
here.
Thank you so much, Justice Austin. It was really helpful.
Okay, well, I have a question here. It says, can we ever own the lands we live on?
Mhm.
Well, that's something that the Navajo Nation Council and our leaders need to really, really talk about that and get that title away from the federal government and give complete title to the Navajo Nation. Now, the Pueblos over in New Mexico, they have titles to their lands, but their titles to their lands came from Spain. They're Spanish grants that were granted them way back a long time ago, 1600s, whatever it was. So they have title to their land, but the federal government still has a trust duty, trust status over those lands itself. So they can't be sold. So if you're gonna get land, the title to this land yourself, then it has to be done in a way where the states don't come in and start treating you as a private party, private landowner, and starts taxing the Navajo Nation. You can't have that. You gotta be done in a way where the states cannot tax the land, but you hold title to that land itself. Now, the Navajo Nation has Big Bow Ranch over here by Seligman, but that is held in private ownership. So the Navajo Nation has to pay taxes to the state for that land that they hold, 60,000 acres, but this has to be treated differently. So yes, it can do that. It can be done. I don't see any other questions here. Any recommendations on the never written book? Well, there's a book that a number of us got together. We each wrote a chapter. I think it was called The Navajo Sovereignty. I don't remember exact title. The editor was Professor Lee over from UNM, University of New Mexico. And so there are a number of articles on that. I think it's called The Navajo Sovereignty. I wrote an article on that. There are also the books on Navajo history and Navajo law. I don't really know, not aware of many. There are, there's one but that doesn't deal with Navajo. It's called the Cheyenne Way. It basically talks about traditional law of the Cheyenne Nation. That was written by an anthropologist. I think it was from 1940s, somewhere around there, 1930s or 1940s, but it's called the Cheyenne Way. There's another book dealing with Cherokee traditional laws written by former a dean whose name is Renard Strickland. I think it was called Fire and the Spirits. That's what it is. And what he basically did is he went through the old documents, federal documents, and so sort of reconstructed what you would call Cherokee traditional law using those old documents way back from first contact, 1700s and all that. So he came up with that. And then that's one way of doing it, I guess, where if your tribe has lost a lot of its culture, traditions, all that, maybe even the language. So you might be able to find bits and pieces in history, in the documents, government documents and all that, and reconstruct something out of that. So that is that. Now, in a few minutes here, my book on Navajo Course and Navajo Common Law is really based on my dissertation. I wrote my dissertation on that, and the whole idea was to produce something that members of Navajo Nation Bar Association, attorneys, advocates, judges who practice in the Navajo courts could use more like a reference. Is what it was. That's how I set it up. And so after I finished my dissertation, then I went back into it, and then I rewrote as certain parts here and there. So that became the book Navajo Course and Navajo Common Law. I think when I was in the court, Navajo Supreme Court, I went in the court in 1985. That's when we started emphasizing use of our own cultures and traditions in Navajo court decision making. So Navajo courts and the Navajo common law that we use in Navajo courts, that they were based on that. We came up with a Navajo Nation Supreme Court decision, which basically said that Navajo common law is the law of preference in the Navajo Nation. Of course, the Navajo Nation council is going to come back later and kind of put a limitation on that and say that, the written laws and the code are to be given first preference. Navajo common law can be used to interpret those laws. If there is no law in the Navajo Nation code, then you can rely on Navajo common law. It's basically what it says. I think what it is the Justice Department lawyers started losing cases because we're using Navajo common law. So that's what they did. They came up with this stuff and started, wait a minute, we'll got to use that law that's in the code first as the first law. So that's how that came out. So that's what it is. And what I try to do in that book is I try to organize it in a way where people can understand it. We have these three major doctrines, maybe more, but at the time I was going through this. So three major doctrines. One is called Hojon, the other one is called Ke and Ke. And you look at this, these three major doctrines that make up, I guess you could say, Navajo society, because what it is it really is the foundation on which Navajo society sits, and how we view the universe and how we view everything in the world. And so those three doctrines, I work with those and try to fit these court decisions into these three areas and see how they came out. So that's really what it is. But if you look at it, for example, you look at the doctrine of and K, you find that what it is that regulates a lot of domestic relations. It regulates marriage, it regulates divorce, it regulates child custody, even contract, and all of these. So you have all these legal areas that are regulated under this, basically sits on this foundation of that major doctrine. And then from there, it kind of like a tree, the root is there and then grows out and has branches. So you can go look at it, different branches, maybe domestic relations, maybe contract and whatever it is. It could be, divorce, marriage, property distribution, probate, all that. So that's how it is, I found. So that's what that book is about. Williams versus Lee, very quickly. Williams versus Lee is a 1959 U.S. Supreme Court decision. And what it does is you have a trading post on Navajo Nation. And of course, like Navajo folks, like my grandparents and parents used to do is they go to the trading post and they buy goods on credit And then when you take the lambs and in the fall, you sell your lambs, you get the money, and then you pay the trader. Or else, my mom weaves rocks and all that, and then takes it to the trader and sells it, and then pays off the credit. And so that's what it was. So the trader, Williams, the Williams family had credit with the trading post, and so they bought groceries and all that. They had a bill, and so the trader wanted the money that Bill paid, but the Williams couldn't pay off. So what it did is the trader got the Apache County Sheriff's Office to come out to the Navajo Nation and herd up, round up the sheep that they have, and then pound the sheep and take it in and try to sell it. And so it's what they did is they hauled the sheep off the reservation to somewhere, St. John's or somewhere over there. And so that resulted in the lawsuit. The lawsuit against Apache County ended up in the Apache Arizona courts, and the Arizona Supreme Court rule that the state of Arizona can do that. The state of Arizona has jurisdiction over this lawsuit, and that's what they rule. And then case ended up before the United States Supreme Court. United States Supreme Court says Arizona Supreme Court has no jurisdiction. Arizona has no jurisdiction over this. The Navajo Nation entered into a treaty, the 1868 treaty with the federal government, which gives the Navajo Nation inherent sovereign power over its reservation, is what it said, and also an inherent sovereign power over businesses and all that. And so what is going on is what it's saying is, if you are non-Indian, non-Navajo or non-Indian, probably non-Indian now, is you file a lawsuit against an Indian on the reservation for a contract that you make with an Indian on the reservation, then you can't go to state court. You have to file your lawsuit against the Indian person in the tribal court. Tribes court is what it says. So the state courts have no jurisdiction. It's that the tribal courts, in this case, the Navajo courts, have exclusive jurisdiction. Exclusive jurisdiction means that you can't go anywhere else. You have to go into the Navajo court. So basically that was called a victory for the Navajo people, Navajo Nation, and also for Indian people. So what it is any non-Indian who files a lawsuit against an Indian who lives on the reservation where the contract or transaction is made on the reservation, then the tribal court for that tribe has exclusive jurisdiction to decide the lawsuit that's brought. So that's what that is about. And then one of the things that's very important, that decision is, that says the non-Indian came onto the reservation and made the contract with the Indian on the reservation. So you voluntarily went onto the reservation, engaged in business transactions with the Indian on the reservation. So you did that. So you have tied yourself to the tribe's jurisdiction, is what that case says. So that's what Williams versus Lee is. Any other questions?
We have a question. If Navajo Nation Oil and Gas wants to drill for helium on a home site or grazing area, is there any legal recourse in Navajo courts for something like that?
Well, I don't know much about Navajo oil and gas. I do. I think that's in response to it was formed in response to a case called Cotton Petroleum. I think it came out of New Mexico. New Mexico was taxing coal mining on the Navajo Nation. Navajo Nation also had this tax. And so what the company tried to do was either exclude Navajo Nation taxing or state tax, and claiming that it was being taxed twice for the same resource. So it went up to the 10th Circuit. 10th Circuit said the state of New Mexico has authority to tax on Navajo Nation because it's not, this stuff about extracting and all that, doing business is not value that came out, value, they call it value added resource or something like that, that is not something that was produced on the Navajo Nation the drilling and all that was done by a non-Indian company. They're extracting that so the non-Indian company can be taxed by the state. So what the Navajo Nation did is, I think it set up Navajo Oil and Gas Company to say that now we have our own company that can drill the Navajo Nation, extract oil and all that type of stuff. So the state, you can't tax us because it's Navajo Nation owned. The value, it belongs to Navajo Nation. So that's basically what's going on. So the question is, can Navajo Nation oil and gas drill, I guess not necessarily in your home site lease, but can drill in the area you would claim as your grazing area or something like that? Well, again, there's a customary doctrine called customary use area. And the Navajo courts have been developing this for quite a while. And so basically what it says is, if you have a grazing permit for a certain area where you graze your livestock and you use that grazing permit and you're within that area, then you have rights to that. You have rights to the surface area. So what happens is if Navajo Oil and Gas is going to drill in there, then they should have some kind of permission from you to drill in there, because that is your customary use area. That's what it is. Now, of course, the Navajo Nation has authority to get under, has authority over that resource that is under the ground. But under Navajo customary law, if you are the customary usage, you have a grazing permit for that area, then you have an interest in the surface area. So before the surface area should be disturbed, then they should have some kind of agreement with you, is what it is. It's very similar to those cases that they have down in Belize, where you had the Mayans who claim customary usage over the surface area, but then under the law of that nation, then Belize owns the resources under the ground. So under international law, the court decision that came out of that, they said that there has to be some authorization from the Belize community before the state can drill in there. And then also they may be agreements made between the Mayans and the state where they will share some of the benefits, is what it is, or at least some kind of compensation should be paid to the Mayans. It's similar to that. So if you have a grazing use area there, and then the Navajo Oil and Gas is coming in and claiming that they're going to be drilling you, whether you agree or not, it shouldn't be like that. It should be where they should negotiate with you, at least for the surface damage, the amount of damage that's going to be done to the land, perhaps the vegetation and all that, whatever is there, that you have an interest in that because you have a grazing permit. So there should be some kind of compensation given to you, or some kind of negotiation, at least consultation should take place.
Thank you so much, Justice Austin. I have a question. I think we've answered all the questions from the chat, but my question relates to the possibility of some kind of an overlay system, because I believe that we can actually create a system on top of the trust law system that allows for something that is alienable and perfection, essentially, of people's traditional land claims. I wouldn't necessarily say customary use areas, because there is sort of a developed area of law in the Navajo court systems defining what constitutes a customary use area. And I don't think it's broad enough, honestly. But I do believe that our people know the boundaries of their lands because they're monitoring it, they're grazing their livestock, they're maintaining those invisible boundaries that have been established over generations. But I believe we could create a registry where we record all of those claims and allow people to perfect them in that manner, and create something that could be transferable and even split in half, split into pieces. And that could be a way of unlocking our land for housing and allowing our families that have been on this land and who know and believe in their heart that that is their land. And everyone around them also believes that as well. But it gives them an opportunity to monetize that. Like they could sell to another tribal member, transfer to another tribal member, and then utilize the proceeds of that to solve their own problems. Like, for example, putting in a solar energy system. If they live really remote and probably will never get an electrical line, that empowers them at the household level to solve their problems. And another really important thing is a lot of the homes that are in these traditional home sites are very old and need weatherization. And as we go into intensifying climate conditions under climate change, it's going to be more and more important for homes to be weatherized and designed to withstand those increased temperatures. So whether that's, better insulation or even just access to solar electricity for access to fans and refrigerations. So I just think this is really, really important, and it's something that has to be done. And there's no reason. I mean, property law is really interesting and is sort of, the sky's the limit, whatever you want it to be, in terms of what I've seen in the property context. I mean, like in New York City, you can own, half of an apartment or one floor in a building. So I don't see why we couldn't create some kind of an overlay system and recognize what our people know and believe to be true in terms of their rights to the land, and restore the power of the people to control the land, rather than just accepting these fictions, these legal fictions, that this land is owned by the United States or even by our tribal government. Because I think the laws should be reflecting our reality and our truth as Diné people. To me, that would be a true expression of sovereignty. But I'd be really curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I agree with you. My thinking is what the Navajo Nation should do, Navajo Nation Council, is they should look at the entire area, the land surface that we call Navajo Nation, all the way to the limits of its boundaries, and then zone the whole thing. They need to set aside areas that, for example, we have traditional people that do offerings and stuff at certain areas, and they need to have those areas as protected sites where they set aside these sacred sites, sacred areas. And then we also need areas need to be set aside as parks where there should be no development. The same thing that you do with the federal government has these parks and all that where there's no development. And then certain areas for example, forestry and all that to keep them in pristine traditions, all of those lakes and stuff. And that's what we need to do. You go out in Navajo Nation right now and you find people building all over, whatever they want. You have people are trying to establish building businesses here, but then you have people behind them that are living in hogans and all that, setting up, shade houses and all that. And it's a situation where we really don't have any zoning. And some of these areas, like large communities, like, for example, Shiprock and Crown Point near Window Rock, those areas need to have boundaries around them. Because what is going on is the population is expanding, and the more and more population increases where people are living on the reservation, then you're going to have some way of regulating land use. And people often say, land is our greatest resource, and we don't treat it like that. You go out now and people building all over the place, and then you have junk cars all over, trash all over, and then you also have, lack of zoning, all that type of stuff. It's something we're wasting a lot of acreage of land because we don't have that zoning, and it needs to be zoned, the whole area, in certain areas set aside for certain things. Now, in terms of my view on this is, I'm not really anyone who deals with economic development, But I think what we need to do is, and these, once you set out areas like for Shiprock area, or whatever it is, and then in those areas, you say, well, this is where business development is going to take place. This is where residential areas are going to be, and you set them aside like that. And then what happens then is if you're going to develop an area for certain areas going to be set aside for business, then the Navajo Nation should put infrastructure in there, you know, set them aside by plots, 1 acre or whatever it is, and then run the infrastructure through there in order to have the sewer lines and water lines and all that already in there. And then say, okay, people, whoever wants to invest here, there's 1 acre available here, here. You can put business development. You want to put up a restaurant or something right here. You have an area, you can lease it. No, right now that leasing stuff is all under federal law too. I think 75 years now or something like that. Federal leasing laws. I haven't looked at it recently, but it's somewhere around there. And so during the time that you have this lease, the business lease, you should be able to sell it. You know, right now what is happening is the leases are there because there's a possibility you may end up losing it at the end of the lease period. People do not develop their property. And so if you have that property, you put up a restaurant there and you want to expand it and all that, then you can't do it because you're not sure whether you're investing. You're just going to still have that investment at the end of the lease period. So it should be done in a way where you can sell that business to another person, you know, like selling a regular business off the res. See, sell it, their improvements and all that, and that person then gets a new lease and all that. So for a situation where it can be sold. Now, if you have a business here, and then you don't have anyone who's going to buy that from you at any of your lease period, there should be, Navajo Nation should have funding set aside where the Navajo Nation will repurchase that lease from you. Stuff like that. And these are just my ideas. I don't know how they will work, but I'm not anyone who's expert in economics. But I think that's something along those lines. And the same thing should be happening for residential areas. You set aside residential area, you know, build houses and there, sell the houses. And then these people should be able to sell those houses, even on trust land, and to another person who wants it. So it should be done like that. I think we're way over time.
Yes, thank you, Justice Austin. That was really helpful. I don't know if you have another moment or two, but we do have a couple other questions if you have the time available.
Oh, one great question here. Just says, for purely hypothetical purposes, can the net courts doesn't bestow personal status on our sacred mountains and geography? Absolutely, you can do that. Do trees have rights under Navajo customary law? Yes, they have rights. You know, certain geographical areas, sacred sites, do they have rights? Yes, they have rights. And the Navajo Nation laws will say those things. Okay, thank all of you.
Yes, thank you, Justice Austin. Thank you so much for giving of your time and for the wonderful, absolutely wonderful presentation you provided. I think it was really insightful to our viewers, and the Q&A was really engaging and interesting. So thank you so much, Have a beautiful day.
Okay, thank you.